Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 1st of July, 2025. Let's get started. So, really enjoyed talking with this guest. His name's Alex Tarascio. He's from Cygnal, which is a private GOP polling firm. And last year, they were the most accurate out of all of the GOP polling firms out there. So they've developed quite the reputation in the space. Had a really fun time talking with Alex about how are these polls actually conducted? Where do these numbers come from? What type of clients do they work for? Of course, we hear about the polls that get published, but you do a lot of private work. How are those different? This podcast is about national security and geopolitics. So I had to ask, how much do the American people really care? I mean, obviously, I'm a complete policy wonk. And if you're listening to this, you probably are too. But how many of us are actually out there? How much do the American people actually care about foreign policy and national security? Other than, when we having a big rah-rah moment. Good question to ask as we come up on the 4th of July. And he had a great story, too, about supporting democracy in Iran, trying to support democracy in Iran, with an organization that he used to work with, that I'll be honest with you, it sounds like a CIA kind of operation. Just my take. Anyway, really excited to share this with you guys. With that, let's go to Alex. Well, good morning, Alex, and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing really well, Scott. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's a pleasure to talk with you. Could you introduce yourself in your own words to the audience real quick?
Of course. My name is Alex Tarascio. I am a pollster at Cygnal. We're a private GOP polling firm. And about half the work that I do is international. It's primarily for political clients, for corporate, for public affairs work, people who have any sort of a problem where public opinion is a factor. And about half of it is around the world and half of it is the United States. But the firm predominantly does work for Republican candidates. We did some work for the Trump campaign, for governor campaigns, Senate campaigns, all the way down to mayors and city councils all over the United States.
Nice. Now, I'm also tracking that you guys are known as the best polling outfit in the U.S. right now. Is that correct?
We are the most accurate private GOP polling outfit. So,
really segmenting that down.
Yeah, well, that's on brand for a pollster to segment things. But there's big differences between a private pollster and a public pollster. Okay. I'm happy to go into them if you're curious. But
let's talk about that real quick. Most people don't know about how this industry works, so we can just take some time going through that.
Yeah, I mean, I found this out when I became a pollster. We have clients, but we also come out with public polls, and we just released one, or we will be releasing one a little bit later today. I'm hoping to talk about that. But when I first started, I asked, who pays for this? And the response I got was, well, we do. And so when a private pollster puts out a public poll, which we're about to, the purpose of that is to generate public conversation, to show our methodology, to kind of showcase our wares so that we can have something to point to publicly if people want to hire us. But 99% of the research that we do is for clients who have a private need. And the difference in what we're going to release publicly and what we'll give somebody privately is that we'll give them all of it, including maybe what makes their issue look bad. We'll test 10 messages for, say, a politician. And it may be that 5 or 6 of them just poll really terribly. Now, they could take that information and say, okay, let's focus on the 3 or 4 that poll really well, or we need to do some work on the ones that poll terribly because they're really important to me. And so my job is not to tell the campaign what to do. They have to have their own vision on their own. They have to exercise leadership. If you're looking to your pollster for leadership, you're in a bad situation. But I can tell you how to get there. And a big part of my job is to give a pathway to victory for whoever that client happens to be, whether they're political or corporate.
Okay. The polling industry, ever since 2016, has really taken a hit in American popular culture. Polls back then were wildly inaccurate, at least the ones that were shared with the public and talked about on news media. We're almost a decade past that right now. And you guys, I think, had a 92% success rate in 2024 with calling races, which is pretty darn good in almost any industry, except maybe landing airplanes. But that's a separate issue. So what's changed from 2016 to now that polling industry, even though it still has a pretty terrible reputation, to be frank, y'all are actually pulling out accurate information? What changes in the industry have taken place in the past almost decade?
So some parts of it have changed a lot. Some parts of it have not changed so much. A big thing that my company Cygnal does differently is that we embrace, particularly for our political polling, multi-mode polling. And so that means that when we have 1,000-person sample, some of those people are coming from an online panel. Some of those people are coming from an SMS online. Some of those people are from live phone calls. The United States doesn't do a whole lot of in-person polling, although I do that in some other parts of the world. And so you get people from multiple different sources, and you can verify them with the voter file so that you know who you're talking to. So you don't have somebody who happens to be lying, which is uncommon. That doesn't happen a whole lot about who they are, but it does happen sometimes. And so we can verify who they are. We can pull them from different sources, and that increases the accuracy. The old school way of doing polling, and the way that some public pollsters predominantly still do it, is only live phone calls. Now, when you do that, you have at best these days a 6% response rate. And so if you want to get 1,000 people, you need to make 6,000 phone calls. That's actually a little optimistic these days. Usually it's going to be more than that. And that's expensive. It's slower. And you're going to get a certain kind of person who has the time and inclination at 6 p.m. during dinner time to answer a poll. Now, I love answering polls. I've always wanted to before even I got into this line of work, but my wife—
You were the first person I've ever heard say that.
I enjoy doing it. I use them. And so I want to give back. It's part of my civic duty. Maybe it's just part of getting older. But every time I do it, it's never convenient. And so my wife always looks at me and she has a look on her face like, really? Do you really have 25 minutes or 20 minutes to just sit there and answer a poll? We're about to have dinner. And, she sucks it up and grits her teeth because she does the same thing. She likes answering polls as well. But you get self-selection and you get people who are a little weird. I'm a little weird. I'm probably not representative of the general public. And so that's something that is a problem with live calls only. And if you can diversify your sources, then you're getting a more accurate sample of the U.S. electorate.
Gotcha. Now, you said before that you guys work for the GOP primarily, and other private sector clients, but how does that sort of alignment in the polling industry impact results, or how is that accounted for when you're doing polls? Because it does seem to be that polling firms, either they're associated with a press outlet, or they only work for Democrats, or they only work for Republicans. There seems to be very little cross-pollination.
Yeah, there is very little cross-pollination. There's some firms that will work for independent candidates. Mm-hmm. There's a few that work for like RFK, for instance, and they might work for a Republican or a Democrat. They're really uncommon. The vast majority of them are either public, as you said, partnering up with media, or they are working for the Republican or the Democratic parties. The way that impacts the work, I think it's a popular conception that if you're a Republican firm that you want to put your thumb on the scale for Republicans. And that's just not the case, at least not for a private pollster. Mm-hmm. Maybe for a public Republican pollster, I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody in particular, but my measuring stick of success is election day. And so we get tested based on how accurate we are. And if we're not accurate, then we're not going to get hired the next year. And so we have a very strong incentive to make sure that we are accurate, not that we're making our client look good in between that testing time. And so accuracy is extremely important to us. And that means that in the private polling, we can ask harder hitting questions that, again, may not make our clients look good. How it affects us publicly, I'm not going out of my way to make anybody look bad. I don't think about that whenever I'm writing polling questions. I want to find the truth to a matter, and I want to do it in a fair way. If you ask a question that is just horribly biased in a way that a Democratic pollster would look at that same question and say, I would never ask the question that way, that's not a very good question. Mm-hmm. And you can ask questions and write them in such ways to elicit the response that you want, but that's the difference between a push poll and a proper poll. And just as I'm judged on accuracy, I'm also judged on the quality of the questions that I'm asking. And so, as a private pollster, we are interested in truth. A private Democratic pollster, they're interested in truth too. Whenever I sit on panels with Democratic pollsters, we have a ton of agreement because we're seeing the same sources and we're seeing the same public opinion. We're working off the same music sheet, really, even though we're asking different questions and we may have different goals. Public pollsters, they have different incentives. They're not in the business of getting private clients. They're in the business of getting clicks. And so I won't speak any further about those.
All right. So why is there this bifurcation between Democratic and Republican? If you guys are after the truth, especially on the private side, going after the same information, is there a reason why polling companies don't service both sides typically, or what drives that division?
I think some of it is the way partisanship has taken shape in the United States, but it's not a new phenomenon. This has been the case for 30 years, 40 years. I don't know that there was ever a time when it was not the case. And it's because your pollster really should be, in the way that we do electioneering and campaigns in the US, they're like your consigliere. They are your source of truth on a campaign, and they give you advice and they give you counsel. And a candidate should have a relationship with their pollster, just like they have a relationship with their campaign manager, but they may not have a relationship with the guy who does their fundraising or the guy who places digital ads. That's because your pollster is going to tell you, is it working? What's not working? How do you need to change? And that's a really intimate relationship with a political campaign. It's a relationship of trust. And so if you are working, even in, I won't name any campaigns, but even if there's a hard primary with two Republican candidates that went against each other, if you worked for an opposition candidate and there's still some salt in those wounds, you're probably not going to get hired by that campaign because they're going to be suspicious of you because you worked against them at one point. And so magnify that and zoom out and look at what it would be like if you had worked for Democrats, if you'd given advice to Democrats. And then people will wonder, well, are you going to repeat some of these conversations that we're having here where I'm being candid with you when you work for a Democrat the next time? Maybe I'm not going to trust you. And so that's just the way that campaigns take shape here in the US. When I work around the world, that partisanship is not a factor as often. It happens sometimes, but I think the default is that people work for lots of different campaigns. But the trade-off is that they don't get into the room where it happens. And they don't have those positions of trust, and they're not the consigliere in the way that they are in the United States.
Gotcha. Now, are those conversations between you and a campaign protected in any way? Because I imagine there's not like attorney-client privilege, or is there a way if that stuff gets into the record, it could be FOIA'd later? If it becomes part of a campaign record that received funding from somewhere, how is that information between you and the client protected, or is it just a handshake and a whisper deal?
Well, it wouldn't be FOIA-able to use a really just terrible phrase because it's not government funded, and you can use a Freedom of Information Act request on something that the government is funding. That's your right as an American citizen. But a campaign is not funded by the government. And so there's no expectation of that there would be transparency in those conversations. And there really shouldn't be. You'd lower the quality of the campaign if you did. But there's also no legal, like, attorney-client privilege analog. It's reputation. It's a really small community. There's not that many pollsters out there. I know most of them. And, even expand that to other kinds of campaign advisors. So much of this business in the campaign world is based on reputation. Now, if I'm working for a corporate client, that's a little bit different. But in the campaign space, it's based on reputation. And like, you don't do a public tender. You're not procuring or doing a hiring process to get the 10 people that's like a disinterested process. You're hiring based on trust. You're hiring based on people that you know, and trust is so much more valuable than ability, even in many cases. And so you have to, there's a lot of incentives for people inside the system to abide by those unwritten rules.
Gotcha. Now, when you're doing, you guys are talked about a public facing poll that you're releasing, I believe later today, and we can talk about that in a second. Is there a difference in the approach between the information you release in a public poll versus a private poll? Because obviously, if you're being paid by a client, you want them to have the best information, even if it doesn't look good for them. But if you are a GOP pollster and you're doing a poll, is there certain information that you wouldn't feel comfortable putting into a public-facing poll if it's going to look bad for the GOP?
Yeah, I think the best way that I have seen it play out in almost every poll that I do is if we're going to do a benchmarking poll. That's one that's at the beginning of a political campaign. They're a little bit longer in question count. The purpose of a benchmarking poll is going to be really different than the purpose of a public poll, which is to generate public interest. I want to poll and ask questions that people will find interesting, and it can't, by definition, be geared toward an individual campaign. But there's a certain kind of there's a process that we apply when we do message testing, and we create message maps. And it's a battery of questions. It takes maybe 15 questions inside a survey, which is between a third, maybe a quarter of the survey if it's a long one. Graphic questions represent another third to a quarter. And so it's a lot of commitment inside a questionnaire to do a messaging battery. And I'll test, say, 10 messages and bracket those messages by asking people what candidate they're going to vote for in a given election. And then if my client is candidate A, then 7 of my messages are going to be pro candidate A, and maybe 3 of them will be anti-candidate B, or I might throw in a few anti-candidate A questions to balance things out. And then I'll measure which of those messages is the most effective. And when we do messaging maps, then we can see what message, say it's a Republican, candidate A is a Republican, they're going to run in Texas. And a message map will tell me that cutting taxes is a very popular message, but it doesn't change anybody's minds. It's not persuasive because the electorate that we're working with there in Texas, in my hypothetical, they already support candidates who want to lower their taxes. And so instead, they're looking for candidates who are more anti-establishment. And so I have another candidate that is a sitting elected official versus a candidate who's an outsider. And maybe that outsider message resonates a lot stronger and changes people's minds. And so it gets them to, on my poll, change their minds from an opposed to a support, or from a neutral to a support. I can see that movement. And so when we create message maps, we track movement for a campaign, for a candidate, and that is highly actionable for my clients. It's not very useful for a public poll because it's so targeted, it's so specific. And so it's not as though I would never do it because I can't, but it's very much focused and tailored for an individual campaign, candidate, or a company and their issue and changing minds. And so it's just not as germane. I don't think it would be as interesting to the public. And if it were in some cases, it would be highly private information and that campaign wouldn't want to release it publicly. And so it's just different types and they serve different purposes. That's I think the most practical reason why we do them differently.
Okay. Now, this poll that you got coming out now, is this, I mean, we're still pretty early in the Trump administration, but imagine this isn't your benchmarking poll. Is this just a monthly update? How often do you do these polls?
So this is our NVT, our National Voter Trends poll. Mm-hmm. And those are never benchmarking polls. And just you didn't ask this question, but benchmarking poll is something you do in the beginning of a campaign versus a brush fire poll. You do those later in the campaign, and those don't have the messaging tests because at that point you're committed on messaging and you just want to test movement in the campaign. Our NVT is only for public consumption. And so we ask some questions that we've been asking for 3+ years, and that's to track trends. That's like, what issue are you voting on? What's the most important issue priority that you have? Approval rating or favorability for the Democrat and Republican parties for the president. So we have approval rating for Donald Trump. We have approval rating for Biden before that. And so you can track that over many years. And so that's something that's unique to our voter trends poll that just wouldn't apply to a candidate poll or a campaign poll that we're going to do. And in this one, I think the most interesting data point that I've seen is that Trump's favorability has been really sticky. And compared to his first term, it's quite a bit higher. And it just isn't moving a whole lot. It's certainly not moving down. When it is, it's moving down by a point or so. I think in this last poll, he might have dropped by a point and a half. But the national direction, the country direction, people think that the country is on the right track at the highest rate since we started doing this poll in September 22. Mm-hmm. And we always do right track, wrong direction, because you don't want to say right track, wrong track, because people confuse them. And so you change up that latter word and people can differentiate them a little bit easier. And so we have the least distance between the right track, wrong direction number since we started tracking the poll. And that's really interesting for a lot of reasons. Both Democrats and Republicans had thought that the country was on the wrong track during the second half of the Biden administration. And right now, it's not as though Democrats think the country is on the right track at particularly high rates, but there are substantial numbers who do think it is right now. And many more Republicans say that the country's on the right track. And so That's quite a bit different than we had over the last 3 years.
Gotcha. Now you started that in September 2022. So that's the very tail end of, that's halfway through the Biden administration. Mm-hmm.
Just before midterms.
Yeah, just before midterms for the red wave that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So have you compared that data set against any other older polling from other pollsters that you have access to try to pull new trends, or are you really just focused on the past 3 years?
In terms of like right direction, wrong track, our numbers are they don't look dramatically different. Okay. I don't know that they look different at all compared to other pollsters. One difference is we're only looking at likely voters. And so it's something that you might hear a lot about.
Gotcha. So there's a whole segment of the population that if they're not showing up for the polls, you're not even counting them. It's really just focused on who's going to impact the election.
Who's going to impact the election. And so in that way, we're comparing apples to apples the whole way through.
So the general sentiment of the company might be different or feel different than the folks that you're focused on because a lot of people, frankly, just don't show up to vote.
Yeah. And so there's two other real options for like voter sampling. You can either look at all adults, which I just think is generally not a useful way to do it if you're doing political polling, because all adults are not the most useful people in a political context, because you would least want all registered voters, because those are all potential voters. But for us, we want likely voters, people that are actually going to turn out and vote, because we don't have 100% voter turnout in the United States. And so if I'm polling on all voters for a campaign and then we switch to just registered voters, it might be that the messaging that resonates well for their campaign resonated with the people who aren't going to show up and vote. That's not useful. That's not a reflection of reality to that campaign. So they can't make a decision based on a hypothetical universe that's not going to turn out to vote. Now, if I'm working for a company, if I'm doing something for Coca-Cola, McDonald's, then voters, that's not the most relevant screen. Any adult, any person can buy a Coke. And so you'd want to look at every potential consumer and probably contrast them against current consumers. Sampling is a huge part of what we do, and defining our sampling universe. We have a sampling team. It makes up about half the company. Defining who we think matters in a given context is exceptionally important. And if you get that wrong, then you're going to bring in the wrong people, and you're going to sample wrong, and you're ultimately going to get your polling data wrong.
Does your orientation, or the fact that you work with the GOP almost exclusively, or at least exclusively in the political sphere in America, does that impact the type of corporate clients that you can work with? Because I'm imagining, like right now, Elon Musk and Doge and that whole meltdown between Trump and Elon, very controversial, really polarizing for a lot of folks. So does your relationship with the GOP limit or direct the amount of companies in the private sector that you can work with?
Probably. I think that phenomenon is less a factor today than it was in like 2018, 2019, 2020, where
really
would not have been as comfortable, and they would have actively wanted to dissociate from working with a firm that's connected to the Republican Party. That's less a factor today. And in the corporate space, I go on LinkedIn and you can see that people and their companies and their logos. You see a lot fewer rainbows today than you did a year or two or three ago. But really, in 2020 is like the high watermark of this cultural movement that really rejected Republican politics in the corporate boardrooms. And that's just less a factor today. But if a company wants to hire my company, it should be, it usually is because they have a political issue, not just because they want to test, new Coke versus Diet Coke. Although we have lots of strong opinions about that in the office, and we're happy to do it. And there's,
I don't think we need to pull on that one. That everyone knows,
right?
That'd be a waste of money.
They do know that, and they pulled that very aggressively, I'm sure, and they did, and they have lots of techniques. Some of them are different, but in the corporate setting, it's less a factor today than it used to be. But really, most of the people that I'm talking to, it's a benefit. And so there are times that I work with a Democratic firm. I think that if I was working with a company, that'd be my recommendation. If they're really concerned about balance, rather than get a company who's just not political, get two companies, and we can work together. And then you can capture those political dynamics that exist on the right and the left, because that's just the nature of the environment right now. If your company is a little bit more political, so say like a Bud Light, where they've been so enmeshed in politics recently, pretending politics doesn't exist isn't going to help them. They need people who can understand what the consequences will be on either side.
So when you say work together, does that mean hire you to do one poll and a Democratic firm to do the same poll essentially, and then compare the results, or actually hire you and a Democratic firm and put together a team that does the poll together from start to finish? It
can work both ways.
Okay.
I've seen it work lots of different ways. There really aren't that many pollsters. And so we kind of all know each other. And even though we're competitors, we tend to be reasonably friendly because we're in the same space. And so when there are opportunities to work together, it's good to have there are Democratic firms that I trust to do good work more than certain other firms. It doesn't mean that others do terrible work, but I just have more confidence personally. I think that they get the numbers right. I think they ask questions in a fair way, and they understand the political dynamics on the left really, really well. And so they have insights and they can capture certain things better than I would be able to, because that's not the space that I live in. And versus we work for a ton of Republican primary elections, and we know the differences between different types of Republican electorates in different states. And so that expertise is really what you're hiring. And the ultimate questionnaire could be the same. It could be a little bit different, but a company isn't going to have that expertise. And so they bring us on to split the difference and kind of cover their bases.
Gotcha. Well, pivoting back to Trump, everyone's favorite topic, I know.
Always. For the past 10 years.
Oh, yeah. Can't get enough of them. So you said that it looks like right now Trump's actually doing better in his favorability rankings, or he has better scoring better on the mark of were the companies moving in the right direction than he did last go around?
Both those are true.
Okay.
So the biggest change that I saw, this is actually from our April poll to our May poll, and we're talking about June today, but the beginning of April feels like 1,000 years ago to some, but it was a fairly chaotic start to a month. That was when Liberation Day was announced. It was when, if you paid close attention to your stock portfolio, then you had a bad time.
That's why I stopped looking. Wasn't worth looking at.
That's the smart thing to do, right? But from the beginning of the month to the end of the month, I expected that Trump's favorability was going to drop probably 1 or 2 points, because we had polled in April right in the middle of when everything was happening, but public opinion wouldn't have set in yet. It usually takes 1 to 2 weeks. But the time that we polled a month later, so it was the first week in May, his approval or his favorability, which is a little subtly different than approval rating, but his favorability actually went up by about a point, which was remarkable and not what I expected. And so there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that most Americans are not invested in the stock market such that they're going to be really upset if it goes up or down, which is really different than it was 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago, when I think America was kind of collectively bought into American institutions more. And if the stock market went down, we'd see that as a bad thing, even if we weren't personally invested in it. And so that is a change. And since fewer people were invested, then it just affected them less. That's one. Another is that the month ended a lot stronger than it began. And so we had the best May, I think, since 1990. And so if you paid attention to your stock portfolio in both April and May, terrible April, great May. That's just kind of the nature of how these things work. And so you made a lot of money in May. That probably is a bigger factor in my mind, that there's a sense that for people who want to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, and this happens in every presidential administration, that for the first 6 months or so, voters want to give some space to their politicians to make good on the promises they made on the campaign trail. People are also exhausted of the election, and so they withdraw a little bit. And that lasts 6 to 12 months, usually less than 12, until something occurs to anger people again, and then they get politically activated for the next election. We're in that space right now where people are withdrawing a little bit more. But his approval rating still went up, or his favorability still went up. And so I think that's because the stock market dynamic, people want to see him keep these promises. They see that he's doing something. I don't think there's a ton of understanding of why the trade deficit matters among most people. And they want to give him some space to do what he said he was going to do. The fact that things aren't continuing to tank is a positive. Although, I wouldn't say that makes tariffs a overwhelmingly popular policy. He's much more popular on cutting taxes is fair place to be for our June poll that we're seeing, and for immigration issues. So has overwhelming favorability among people who think that's an important issue right now. And so that's a safe place for him to spend his time to focus. I think cutting government waste is another one where he has a lot of support. Tariffs, a little bit less so. So if he focuses more on the former and less on the latter, then that's a good place for him. In June, I think his approval rating hung around where it was in May. I think it went down by about a point. I have the deck up here, and I can tell you in just a second.
Okay.
So his approval rating changed by, it was 1.5 points. So it went down by 1.5 points. And that's still higher than it was in the vast majority of the first term. It's where he was in April, more or less. And I think that tells you that his favorability is staying fairly sticky. The people who like him are liking what they see. There's less chaos than there was in the first term. And that this is essentially what people have come to expect from Donald Trump, and they're getting what they voted for.
Gotcha. And how are the tariffs themselves polling? How are people reacting to them? How do they feel about that?
So I did a question on it, this survey, and asked people what they think of tariffs. I'm going to pull this up so I can give you the exact wording. And I gave them 3 options. Do you think that tariffs are, or rather, introducing the topic that Donald Trump has introduced tariffs with the goal of bringing jobs back home to the United States as a way to pressuring U.S. companies to reshore production here. That's his goal. Which of the following statements comes closer to your view? And the greatest proportion, but not by any means a majority, was 34%, do support using tariffs to pressure companies to bring production home. 26% of people support the goal of bringing production home, but they're not enthusiastic about tariffs. And the remainder, 32%, believe that, or they trust the free market approach on trade, and they don't believe that the U.S. government should be using tariffs to pressure companies to change their behavior on trade. Oddly enough, 54% of Democrats said they preferred the free market approach, which is encouraging to me, a Republican. I think that's great. I love it when Democrats are supporting the free market, although it's not traditionally where they've been.
How much of that do you think is them just being rhetorically against whatever Trump's doing day by day? And how much of that do you think they actually support free trade?
I think it's
how much of that is Trump eliciting that response rather than what they actually believe?
I think it's 9/10 choosing something that is anti-Trump.
Gotcha.
I didn't want to give the option of I just don't like Trump and I'm not going to support anything that he does. Had I done so, most of those people probably would have been in that category. And that's not unique to Democrats. I don't want to be unfair to them.
Yeah.
We're a very partisan country, and so there's so many questions. Like zooming out a little bit, when I look at every question in the poll, we have heat maps, and I can see how different demographics fall on every question that we do. On most questions right now, in the past 3 to 6 months, and in the next 3 to 6 months, there's a gender gap that's pretty severe and widening. And so women will oppose something by 13 points, men will support it by 22, and that's gonna be like the general alignment of most questions that people are answering in a partisan manner. Age usually is lining up. Younger women are less favorable toward Trump and Republicans. Younger men are even more dramatically shifting to the right. And among the over 55s, the split is still there, but a little less intense. When I see that breakdown for every question, and I did see it for this tariff one, then that just tells me I'm dealing with a question that's partisan coded. And so people are breaking down into their typical partisan lines. When a question does not elicit that response is when it gets interesting, because that means that people don't view a given topic through a partisan lens. Some of the provisions in the one big beautiful bill, the OBBB, the current budget bill, working its way through Congress, we tested 7 different provisions of it, and some of those provisions did not fall down into the typical partisan camps. And so that's interesting to me. But for this particular question on tariffs, that's basically partisan coded. And the 54% Democrats who support the free market would definitely just say that they didn't support Trump if I'd given that option.
Nice. Now, you mentioned before that you do a lot of polling overseas. Have you polled Trump's tariffs overseas for different clients since they've gone into effect? I
have not, only because those clients don't have any control over if Trump can do anything or not. And so it's not a decision point for those clients. It may be interesting. And so if I did a public poll overseas, I would, but none of the polling that I've done to date overseas has been public. We have done some in the past, but it wasn't something that I worked on. We will ask about people's attitudes towards Trump. And that is interesting sometimes, not always, but I find that if I want to have my clients take an action, then it's more practical to focus on something that is closer to home.
Gotcha.
It does have an effect, though. I don't need to ask that question to know what people think of the tariffs. And obviously in Canada, it played out, horrifically for the Canadian Conservative Party. I did not do any work there during that election, but it was a huge factor. And you didn't need to do a poll. It was extraordinarily unpopular. People felt hurt. They felt surprised. They didn't know what was happening. Although I have met a handful of people in the law enforcement community or adjacent to law enforcement, which they're the only Canadians I've found that saw, if not outright supporting it, they saw a silver lining, and that there are actually some fentanyl issues. There are some organized crime issues. And the ostensible purpose of the first executive order that Trump signed, I think it was on the 21st, that was really aimed at increasing the cooperation between the United States and Canada on fentanyl. And so there are some legitimate points to at least that piece.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, economics and cultural issues, depending on the year, are typically the big drivers on who votes for who and for what reasons. But national security, foreign policy, still incredibly critical and incredibly important, even though they don't get a lot of attention in the news media, unless it's through a domestic partisan lens. But how do national security issues and foreign policy issues show up in your polling? Are there any that you test directly, or are there ways to get after who in the electorate actually cares about those issues?
So I'll answer the last question first. The rate of people who say they care about foreign policy and national security, we bundle that into one category. Mm-hmm. It usually tops out at about 5%. Sometimes it's 3 to 5%. And so in the June poll, it was just under 5%. And
okay, that's more than I thought you were going to say. Okay, there's more of us out there than I thought so. Yes.
It was a little higher than usual. During the election, it was closer to 3. But I asked for every question, what's your top priority? And then after that, for the priority that you named, do you approve of the Trump administration's handling of that issue? And it's not a huge number of people. It's only 5%. But among those 5% who named national security, it was 74% approval rating of the Trump administration's handling of that, which is notable and interesting to me because that has not been my experience as somebody who's spent a lot of time working on issues overseas. I spent about 10 years at a development organization working with democracies and political parties and political activists all around the world. And most people who are in that space, they don't lean Republican for the most part. And I did not expect that there would be a lot of approval there. But Trump is doing a lot of things in that space. Lifting sanctions on the new Syrian government, trying to bring the Ukraine war to an end. I don't know what single sentence I would say to characterize his handling of the Israel-Gaza situation, but if you're paying attention to that, then it's different, let's say. Holding Netanyahu and the Israelis a little bit more accountable than perhaps people expected. Mm-hmm. And generally shuffling the board on a lot of national security issues. And so when I saw that figure, 74% approval among the small number of people. It's dangerous to slice crosstabs too small. That's what I interpreted it to mean, is that he is changing things and we don't have to have intractable 40-year problems that never change. And I think that people like when there are resolutions to issues. And so Trump is doing that, or at least he's working in that direction. Other ways, to your other questions about national security, we ask about Ukraine from time to time. I haven't done it in maybe 2 months, but people want to see the war brought to an end. There's partisanship, certainly. Democrats, I think, are more interested in supporting Ukraine, but it's still like in the 65 percentile or higher of Americans who want to see the war brought to an end. I think that we want, generally, I think Americans want the Ukrainians to prevail. They don't like countries being invaded. They don't like defending invaders who want to take over other countries. But the war on terror experience has exhausted particularly Republicans, but many Americans as well. And, the Afghanistan withdrawal really put an exclamation point on 20 years of war that people look back and they're like, what was this for? What did we get out of this? It looks like the world's more dangerous. It looks like the world's worse. And, why did my children go and fight and die? Why did we spend so much money over this? And I don't think anybody in the public square right now in the political space is making a firm defense of that's convincing about why that was worth it and why doing it again, even if you're not in Ukraine, which I don't view that we are, by helping the Ukrainians defend themselves, why that's a good investment or a good idea. So that's kind of how I see it play out in polling that we've done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm curious how sticky that's going to be. Because one thing I noticed when I was in the Army and I was getting ready to go to Afghanistan, I was in a special operations unit. We're all hyped up. This is our chance to go to war. Most of us have been training for almost a decade at that point for the opportunity. We were ready to go. It was 2020. We were going to be one of the last ones there. But anytime I got outside of my little bubble at Fort Bragg and went and talked to my family, and I don't come from a military family, grew up in Connecticut. My folks are from the Midwest. I'd go travel and visit folks. And most of my extended family didn't even know that we were still in Afghanistan. They were completely disconnected from what was going on, which was shocking because it had consumed my entire professional life up to that point, getting ready to go and then finally getting a chance to go. So the disconnect between how the blob, the foreign policy establishment in DC and the military establishment viewed their role and what their role in the world should be compared to where the American people at was shocking. And I remember being in Afghanistan for the 2020 election where Trump got in, and it shocked a lot of folks. And it shocked them in a way that he was actually serious about us pulling out and being done in Afghanistan. Joe Biden got in. Shocked the folks that he was also, Trump signed the treaty. People didn't think it was real. We were on orders to execute the withdrawal. We were doing it actively, but everyone thought that somehow something would happen and we would stick around. And then Joe Biden got elected. There was a general sigh of relief because here's the establishment figure back in charge. And then folks were shocked when he was like, nope, we're still pulling out. We're done. leave, full stop. And it was amazing the disconnect between the world I was living in anytime I went home and visited family and the world I was living in, serving in uniform, being overseas, conducting operations. Because the two, I could not find a way that the two were actually connected.
Yeah, when you say that, it reminds me a lot of a combination of experiences and data, which is the best place that I like to hang out. In when I left my foreign policy focused profession before I did this, and in that role, I'd worked for the International Republican Institute, and primarily it was State Department funded grants implementing pro-democracy projects, and that might be helping political parties to make a better policy platform. Often it was training parties and activists how to use polling so that they can tie what they want to do to public opinion, and a lot more besides. And in that space, there was a general view that great power conflict was returning, and I think that's a pretty mainstream view in the foreign policy community, and that we were no longer in a unipolar world, and that this was a multipolar world. Either it was now, or that we were entering into that, meaning that we the United States, we have competition from China, from Russia, from Iran, from all over, and that's a bad thing, and that we should want to maintain U.S. Preeminence, dominance, hegemony, whatever. And so if we withdraw from a certain area, then that's a zero-sum game. We leave a gap that will be filled by one of America's rivals, one of America's opponents. And so that's an article of faith in that community. And it's a pretty bipartisan one. You mentioned the blob. That's what the blob believes. And the blob is first and foremost blob, and then Republican and Democrat. When I left that space,
very well said.
It's just, and it's not a bad thing or good thing. It just is.
Well,
you can have an opinion about if it's a good or bad thing. But when I left that space, I kind of had a sense that the American people weren't there. And I did quite a bit of polling on it for foreign assistance, because there's a group of people I care about. I think that it does interesting work as a sector. It's taken a huge hit in the Trump administration. And so I did some polling before that happened, thinking that this was going to be a pretty big issue. I was right about that. And polling on what people think, what Americans think of foreign assistance, and what arguments can move them. Again, getting back to that message testing. Like, if we say that if America leaves in Somalia, then the Chinese are going to come and take our spot, and it's going to help out the Chinese, and it's going to be bad for America, basically. Does that argument help? If we play up the China angle, will that get Americans to support foreign assistance more? And basically, no. They don't love the Chinese. They don't want the communists to come in and take over a given space. But also, if you're in Nebraska, then what do you care about what the Chinese communists are going to do in Somalia? You're never going to interact with either of those countries. Couldn't be farther from your experience. And you've trusted for a long time that this kind of stuff mattered. But does it? Does it really? Does it to you? And can you eat it? Can you clothe your kids in that, in the values of U.S. hegemony worldwide? And the answer for many people is no. And so there's a lot of muscle memory in still saying yeah, we care about these things, but the intensity of it and the personal experience of what that means, I think is changing for a lot of people, and it's weakening. And so the messages that did work well were not those ephemeral intellectual messages. It was messages like, hey, we're not going to leave Americans behind just because we're helping other people. That was the number one that helped. Or in the more morality space, hey, we should help those who cannot help themselves. Women and girls in war zones are uniquely vulnerable to being exploited, and we should help these people out. Most Americans are pretty much on board with that. We are compassionate people, but not endlessly so. And so that line of where we should exercise compassion and when we shouldn't, there's been a reckoning, and it's still ongoing.
Gotcha. Now, so you were working with the International Republican Institute, was its name? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm assuming, is that Republican as in representative government, or Republican as in tied to the American Republican Party?
Republican as in one half of a two-party system. And so there were two institutes, the International Republican Institute and then the National Democratic Institute. And the setup of them was that to have a democracy, that two of the four pillars of democracy, so there were four core institutes that I worked at one of them, is that you have to have a two-party system, because if not, then you don't actually have democracy. You have to have contestation in your elections. And so there was no formal tie with the Republican Party. And then my sister organization, the National Democratic Institute, they didn't have any formal tie to the Democratic Party. And then the other two core institutes were for the private sector, which is, I think, the U.S. institution counterpart is the Chamber of Commerce. And then the Solidarity Center was the last one, and that's for organized labor. This was set up in the 80s when I think organized labor was a little bit more of a factor than it is today. And so those were under the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, which has been much maligned in 2025. It can stand on its own record. I think it does good work and bad work. It's like anything in government. There's some people in there that are super nonpartisan, apolitical people, and there's lots of people that wear the nonpartisan label and then do everything they possibly can to advance a partisan agenda. Like just, people are people in every institution in this country.
Well, I got to ask, as you're out there doing this work, did you ever see examples of the U.S. government using these 4 pillars to get access and placement to influence local elections or local politics in a way that advanced U.S. interests, unrelated to the democratic health of the country that we were there to serve?
Yes, until that last part.
Okay. Okay. How so?
So the people who do this work are do-gooders, and they're also arrogant. And I mean that in a good way. They're arrogant in that we design programs to achieve some goal that we like learn in a classroom. Like, okay, well, what if we empower these people and then those people get elected and then we have a more representative country and that country will be more stable as a result? That's like a basic theory of change. So
yep.
It's not a very good one, but that's what it is. And that's what these sorts of people that I worked with for many years, that's what they sit around and do. And so they pitch programs all day, and there's thousands and thousands of these programs that all have these theories, and most of them don't work, and some of them do. And they advance democracy in small ways around the edges. They empower people that the United States considers the good guys versus the bad guys, who are communists, terrorists, like Hezbollah, Hamas. Like, we can't ever, as the U.S. government, I shouldn't say we, because I don't work for the U.S. government, like empower those organizations. Instead, we should be supporting people on the right and the left, and activists and apolitical people who will contribute to a pluralistic society in the image of the United States and in the West, that's a good thing. But because the people who do this work tend to be partisans themselves, even though they're not political appointees, they're bureaucrats, they're civil servants, there's one political agenda that ends up getting supported more often than others. And so what I might consider political diversity would include people from all political perspectives in a country being represented. And when the U.S. government is trying to help people out, you're not supposed to help people from one party. You're supposed to give help to everybody who wants it, so that there's some equality, so that you're not picking sides beyond like the terrorists and communists.
Yeah.
The communist thing is just an inheritance of the 80s. But when you're working with people who are 95% Democratic, then like there's not a lot of interest in working with politically unrepresented folks on the right. And there is a lot of interest in working with like marginalized groups, and that marginalization takes one side. And so you end up working with like a lot of like women's groups who really only have one political persuasion. You work with a lot of LGBT groups. I've known a lot of really awesome, interesting LGBT groups, particularly in like Belarus and Russia, and like they'll get killed if they, do activism in the wrong way. But if you're doing that in Western Europe, then they have, again, a political persuasion. And so if you're empowering a lot of groups that are all on the left, then it starts to look a certain way. And it's not intentional, but it is an effect of the way that the programs are designed and who designs them.
Gotcha.
And so I don't know if that answered your question precisely, but it is a phenomenon that I observed a lot. And the lack of political diversity in the people who do this work, I think, is a real problem for the U.S.
Okay. Do you think there's a way to fix that? Because it sounds, if I put on my cynical former Green Beret, trained to go overthrow governments in other countries and things that you might want to do, empowering minority underrepresented groups to be able to cause problems for a government is like part and parcel of how you go and mess up somebody else's day in a very low cost, high impact way, which seems to inherently breed resent and mistrust of America and its intentions. So I'm wondering, is there a way to make that work better, or is that something in your estimation we should just get out of that business because there's not a way to set up an institution to do it that's not inevitably going to cause more blowback than help?
I do think there's a way to do it right.
Okay.
I absolutely do. And I think the work is important. Politically, I think the U.S. is going towards the opposite direction, where we're just doing less of it because we haven't liked how a lot of it's looked. There will come a time when we do more of it. And so the way that we could do it better is, like, first and foremost, a lot more political accountability on the bureaucracy. because there's too little of it. And I do think the Trump administration wants to rein in the bureaucracy. Eventually, I hope they do that by putting in more people who are political appointees and have political accountability. That's a little bit like what they've done with Schedule F, but there's
that sounds like a very Republican answer.
That's only half my answer, though. And so the reason why I think that's important is to have political accountability is because it's different skill sets, it's different instincts. And like, you can't design a democracy in a classroom. It doesn't work well. You need to spend time on the ground. You need to understand the political dynamics. An example that I'll give is something that U.S. government, I think, did well in a very, very narrow regard in Iran. I worked on an Iran program. It was our most closed of any of our closed programs. And there's two kinds of people that you'll encounter when you're working with Iranian activists. People who think that the Iranian regime is fundamentally illegitimate and that anything they do to improve anybody's lives or organize in country or do anything political is empowering a system that they think is illegitimate and that they should be working outside the system. There's those people. And then there's people who want to make changes inside the system. Now, I never worked with anybody that was formally connected to an Iranian political party because they don't have real political parties, and the U.S. government doesn't want to support a political system in Iran that's not legit. But there were a lot of women in this case that I worked with who worked to organize women in country to resist forced hijabs and being banned from soccer stadiums, and like lots of little ways in which women's civil rights in Iran are really hurt. And an outcome of that is that Iranian women have come out and protested a ton, like in the millions, several times since I did that work. I'm not attributing it to the work that I did. It's there. It's a powder keg, and it'll come from young women who really are quite educated. They consider themselves pretty Western, and they don't love the way that the government is set up. It is a good thing that I was not ever able to work with like Iranian diaspora generally, because Iranian diaspora, as a general matter, I don't want to like overgeneralize and say it's true for everybody, but they hate the regime. They left, they were forced out, and they're real salty about it and bitter. And so they want to take it down. They want to overthrow it. Many of them don't care whether it's done violently or otherwise. And the US government, when I did that work, just wasn't interested in a violent overthrow of the Iranian regime. You can have an opinion about that. You can think that's a good or a bad thing, but that came from a lot of political accountability and attention on the issue. And if you just left the bureaucrats to their own devices, then they would have worked with anybody. They would have helped out anybody who wanted help. And I think that would have been a bad thing, because you would have ended up helping people out who did things that like weren't in the interest of the United States. Because I don't think America right now wants to violently overthrow the Iranian regime. Like, I just don't think they do. If we're supporting people who want to do what good they can, those women who want to go protest in the streets so that they don't get acid thrown on their faces, so they're not forced to wear a hijab, like I think Americans are basically on board with that, but not going a few steps further. So that was an instance where I think that more political accountability was a good thing. And that if you had that more across the board, then you would have better decision making. And frankly, you'd fire people when they did the wrong thing. And not enough of that happens right now.
So when you're doing this work, who was the president in power at the time?
It overlapped. I did it. Okay. I started doing that work in 2015. So a little bit under Obama, but it was mostly under the Trump administration. And then much later, I didn't do Iran at the time, but some during the Biden administration. And funny enough, the democracy work was the most healthy and vibrant and interesting under the Trump administration, which was not necessarily what people would expect.
Yeah. Now, when you're doing this work, so were you actually in Iran doing it or coordinating virtually?
Offshore. We would go to a third country where these people didn't know that like their work was being funded by an American organization because they could face problems back at home. And so I would work through partners in either Turkey or other countries and have some deniability about who's funding this. And I would come in as an expert. And so it was a little bit more clandestine than anything I've ever done. I like working fully out in the open now. It's a little bit more stress in my life that I appreciate that I don't have anymore. But it does change my view of, I see public opinion on one hand of what Americans think of like democracy promotion. They don't love it generally. But the reality of it is that these are people who are patriots in their own country. And they look at the U.S. and they do see the U.S. as like the shining city on the hill, and they want to emulate that, which is really different than if you go to Germany or the UK or wherever, and you can find all kinds of people who are going to say terrible things about the United States. That doesn't happen in places where the US has truly helped people who really, really needed it. Like if you want to get a dose of patriotism, go to Albania, go to Kosovo. You will find no more pro-American people on earth than the Albanians and the Kosovars. And it's something that re-energizes you as an American when you go around and see that.
Nice. Now, have you ever done polling inside the blob? Is there ever a way to go actually poll the politicians, to poll the generals and the heads of departments and get insight from them on what's important to them and how they can be moved on issues?
Technically, yes.
I imagine you can't just walk around to everyone's office and hand out a survey and say, please fill this out by the end of the week. But
yeah, it's doable. It takes a long time and it's expensive. I'll quote another pollster. There's a British pollster who I was talking with this about this with. Whenever he has clients who want to talk to MPs, he says he charges them no less than £5,000 per interview because he needs to call in a chit every time it's a favor to talk to an MP. Like MP's time is really valuable, and you can extend that to any high level, high power principal. If your sample is like American generals or Fortune 500 CEOs or something, those people are hard to get access to. And they also have some familiarity with public opinion data. And so your results are not going to be as reliable quantitatively. And so if you interview 500 people who are all CEOs, that's useful. But if it's only the Fortune 500, then the likelihood of some of them having lied or have a chief of staff fill out the information is just really high. And so it's difficult to do. There's other ways to get that research done, and a quantitative poll may not be the best one. And so if I had a client ask me that, I would want to drill down more into what do you want to find out? And is there another way to get that rather than a poll? You could do an in-depth interview, which is easier. That's qualitative. Or maybe you can talk to other people. But there are some polls out there. The Business Roundtable does a quarterly poll of CEOs in their membership. And so it's a closed system and it's members, since they're already kind of bought in, and they do it on investment, economic outlook and things like that. So it is doable, but the more you want to make the question sensitive, then the more difficult it's going to be. For example, if you wanted to poll on a piece of legislation, what you're essentially asking to do is the job of the whip in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. And that, a pollster can't do that. That's the job of one person already, and whipping votes is a hard thing to do. And these people work really hard to not get on the record with certain things. And so it's challenging, but technically doable.
Gotcha. Now, as we continue to look at these public polls, as you put them out and other polling agencies, what should America be paying attention to going into the midterms? What issues between now and then are actually going to move how people vote on election day?
So I think that things are going to change between now and then. We're still in the honeymoon period, but right now, something I'm looking at is if this election cycle is going to follow the same trajectory that previous election cycles have followed. I have reasons to think that it may not. Now, I don't know which party is going to prevail in the midterms, but when you have big swings and control switches from one party to another, that most often happens when one party is already in control to a great degree. And so you have a lot of potential energy for a swing in the opposite direction. We're not there right now. Right now, we're here, if it's a swing. It's a very narrow majority. And so I don't think you might see a swing like this, but you might not. There's just not a lot of gravitational pull to, at least in the House of Representatives, liberate a bunch of seats from Republicans that should be held by Democrats because it's so evenly divided. And so something that I'm going to be looking to is how the political realignment is changing and how it's changing on the ground. Because there's a lot of really good, smart people that are looking at House seats and districts that have voted more Republican in the past 3 and 4 elections. And that if that trend continues, then it will make several of those seats, many of those seats, maybe 30 of them, in play for Republicans now. And so it's actually looking a little bit better than you might think for a midterm where Republicans should go in and expect to lose. And so if Republicans prevailed, that would be a huge departure from history. And I would not be entirely surprised if I saw that happen. Although if I were to put odds to it, I'd say it's, maybe 35% likelihood that happens, but that's not terrible. Yeah. And then another one that I'm watching is is young women, young lower propensity voters, women under 55. They're overwhelmingly Democrat. In our poll that we're going to release today, it was about 20% of the electorate. They are disengaging a lot from the news and from politics generally. They are engaging with news much less than every other cohort in our poll. They're answering that they're unsure of more answers than every other cohort. And pair that up together with like the collapse of ratings at like a MSNBC, at CNN. I think this is happening because the election is over, because people are exhausted. And then the last data point that I look to is the collapse of abortion as a motivating issue. It was quite high. I think it topped out at maybe 10% leading up to the election. And now in our June poll, it's at 1.7%. That is tiny. And so why does an issue disappear? Well, it disappears if it's sort of artificially pumped up because of an election. Like illegal immigration has not disappeared as an issue at any point. It's remained an issue in between elections. And so for abortion to have collapsed so much, combined with young women who I think care about it more, disengaging from politics, that's interesting to me. And so are these people going to re-engage? And when they do, and I think they will, what are they going to engage on? Is it just are we going to run on abortion again, like for the Democratic Party? Is it going to be on climate change? I kind of doubt it. So what's the motivating force that's going to get these people off the sidelines? Because right now, I just don't see what that issue is. And that'll, I think, define how the Democratic Party runs, because that's the thing I'm the most interested in right now, is how it reconstitutes itself and, has a winning message, a winning pitch to the electorate in November 26.
Gotcha. And if folks wanted to follow along with the work that Cygnal is doing, where do they find the polls that you're pulling out? Where do they keep up to date with what you're up to?
You can follow us on Twitter. You can go to our website. It's cygn.al, Cygnal. And you can see all of our...
Spelled the weirdest way possible, of course.
It's spelled the weird... It's not the app. I use Cygnal. I use whatever communication method people want to use. If they want me to send them a letter, I'll send them a letter. And so some people like Cygnal. But no, it's Cygnal spelled with a C. And you can find it on our website, on our Twitter. And you can reach out to me personally. I'm on Twitter as well. Happy to answer any questions. Love talking data.
Cool. And then final thing, right before we started recording, we were talking about your hot sauce company that you got going on. So please tell people where they can go and find what I'm sure is the most data-driven, extraordinary hot sauce on the planet.
I mean, I do a lot of it on vibes, but here I'll turn my a little bit.
That's your creative outlet after spending all that time looking at polling data.
Yeah, I need to find a way to like quantitatively judge my hot sauce, but it's Magpie Spice Co. It's Magpie, named after my daughter because she's like the magpie bird, and she used to pick tomatoes and peppers and hide them in my shoes. And so she's 4. So Magpie Spice Co. We're on Instagram. We're getting a website up and running, and hit me up. I'd love to give you some hot sauces.
Awesome. I will be dropping links to that stuff down in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But Alex, thank you so much for talking to us today. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Scott. Likewise.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.